Look, I've never been much of a Saw guy, but I gotta say, for a movie that came out 3 films after the installment that was optimistically titled The Final Chapter, this is shockingly good. I'm not sure the 5-year-old sitting near me in the theater agreed, but that's his parents' problem, not mine, and possibly his future therapist. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jake, the Scary Story Guy, and today we're talking about Saw X, the 10th installment in the infamous Saw franchise. For those of you who are unaware, the Saw movies are the most influential entries in what's charmingly become known as the torture porn subgenre of horror. Essentially, this refers to films in which the torture and mutilation of human beings is kind of the point, it's the whole appeal. And that's nowhere more true than the Saw franchise, which is basically the Fast and Furious of bodily harm, which is actually a pretty good comparison now that I think about it. Both franchises are 10 films long at this point. The most recent installments are called Fast X, Saw X, and they're both the kinds of movies where you know exactly what you're getting when you walk into the theater. Fast and Furious movies, it's people driving cars fastly and furiously, and that is where my insight into that franchise ends. And the Saw movies are about a killer named Jigsaw who places his victims into these elaborate traps of his own design, which require them to mutilate themselves in some way. If they do it fastly and furiously enough, they go free. If not, well, they also go free, I suppose, in the sense that dying is freedom from being alive. Now, I saw the first Saw movie back when I was a teenager and was actually quite surprised by how much I liked it. It wasn't quite as, grotesque and in your face as I thought it would be. It was actually quite philosophically interesting, sort of like a very gruesome trolley problem. But the second one, which I also saw as a teenager, that was more or less exactly what I expected from the series. I just didn't find it interesting or enjoyable to watch. Especially the scene, which will always stick with me, of a woman being pushed into a pit of hypodermic needles in order to find a key. No offense if that's your jam, I truly don't mind gross out stuff and gore in my horror movies. It's just not why I go to horror movies, and it started to feel at a certain point like that's all the Saw franchise had to offer me. That, combined with the fact that the reviews seemed to get worse and worse and worse with each successive installment, and it had been a damn long time since I'd watched a Saw film. But then the reviews started sucking me back in. 7.1 on IMDb, 81% on Rotten Tomatoes. Shit, I gotta go see a Saw movie again, don't I? And honestly, I'm glad I did. I don't want to go so far as to say it's the best film objectively in the whole franchise, not that I'd know even if it was, but I was kind of blown away by how much I liked it. So Saw X is the story of Jigsaw, known to his associates as John Kramer, a man who's dying of brain cancer and seeks an experimental treatment down in Mexico. But when he realizes that there was actually no experimental treatment and it was all just a big predatory scam, he tracks down the people responsible and becomes their worst fucking nightmare. And I don't mean in the sense that, like, that guy you went to high school with does when he posts on Facebook a picture of a skeleton riding a motorcycle with an American flag behind him and it's like, I'm so loyal, but if you ever cross me, I'll become your worst nightmare. No, like, he hooks them up to traps, and if they don't mutilate themselves horribly, they'll die. Now, do I think the reason this film is doing so well critically is that everyone sort of wants to do this to the people who are responsible for their last trip to the doctor's office costing over $1,000? Yeah, that's probably part of it. But to me, this was a movie that just really made an effort when everyone could have expected it to just coast along and cash in. In other words, I think with a lot of Saw movies, if you take away the traps and the gore, what do you have left? It's pretty underwhelming. Whereas here we actually have a coherent and compelling story to go along with all of the viscera, one which actually places the violence in a meaningful context rather than it simply being like, oh man, that was crazy when that guy pulled his arm off or whatever. And Tobin Bell's performance as Jigsaw is actually pretty remarkable. I don't remember him super well in the first couple of movies, to be honest, so I can't speak to whether or not he's always been this good, but he makes an incredibly compelling sort of anti-hero. There's a gravitas and a sobriety to his performance that, I think for the uninitiated, they hear about Saw movies and they just imagine some mindless maniac running around with a chainsaw, but this is really the exact opposite of that. The portrait we get here is of a serial killer, yes, but one with a fairly interesting and strict moral code that the audience might find that they sort of intuitively sympathize with in some ways, even if the courts never would. It's a very well-paced film, too, which I found pleasantly surprising. It manages to sort of whet your appetite for mayhem in some interesting ways in the beginning of the film, while ultimately being patient enough to make everyone wait for the setup to be complete. And once we get there, the traps don't disappoint. We'll say that. They're every bit as stomach-churning as you could imagine. It's really impossible for me not to watch them being like, Could I do that? With the first trap, the one that's advertised on the poster of the movie, I know I could. No question. In fact, I'll go so far as to say he gave the guy 60 seconds, I'd do it in 3. But the first 2 traps in the finale of this film, man. No way. Bring me up for your finest casket, please. And without giving any spoilers, there's a scene near the end of the movie involving John and a kid that I was like, there's some really interesting visual symbolism going on here, and frankly, I just did not expect that from a Saw movie. And I think that's my ultimate takeaway from this, is this is a Saw movie, right? The people who were gonna see it are gonna see it. It's gonna make a certain amount of money no matter what. And if ever there was a movie that the director and the writers could just totally phone it in, the 10th Saw movie would be it. But you just get the feeling that there's some passion behind this film. There's real craftsmanship. There's a very good lead performance. Of course, the usual creativity with the traps, which is, you know, what the price of admission is for. There's a pretty low ceiling for this kind of movie, but Saw X basically smacks its head on it. I don't know if anyone really anticipated saying, yeah, you know, the Saw franchise really found its footing with the 10th movie, but here we are. I'm gonna give Saw X 3.5 stars out of 5. Alright guys, spooky season continues very soon here on this channel. Please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's almost Friday the 13th. I wonder if you can guess what movie I'll be reviewing on that date. And in the meantime, thank you for watching this video, and here's hoping you survive to see the next one.